So today happy to have Diogo with us to share with on test automation camp. So it's a community dedicated to the theme of test automation, as it is clear in the name. So today we'll talk about a bit more than API testing. So we made some meetups in the previous months around how to test for web, mobile, API, etc. It was more as for beginner and medium level. So we talk a bit about REST API specifically last time. But we know that as many companies are starting to use more and more NPI, integrating businesses, user experience and backend, etc., the API have become much more complex than just a simple REST API that we can think it's a CRUD sometimes. So we will talk today about one topic, which is OpenAPI specification and how it can help and make the difference for testing. And Diogo will share his experience based on that, and I'm convinced it will make the difference in how you can approach testing, but also in the first place, building better application through testing. So, Diogo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Antoine. Okay, so let's kick this off. And like Antoine already said, we're going to be talking about OpenAPI specifications and how they can help you in testing, not just in test automation, but testing in general, and then going forward to test automation. So, okay, here we go. So let me just introduce myself. My name is Diogo Rede. That's my LinkedIn over there in case you want to connect and share some ideas. And right now I'm a solution architect and testing advocate at TestRail. It's a big title, but basically what this means is that I help people have a better experience with TestRail. I connect with people. I try to provide valid use cases. Generate some documentation, sample code, etc. More focus on the integrations with automation, etc. But also the overall testing process. Previously, I've been an agile tester, a test automation team lead for a couple of years as well, and I also was a general testing trainer in most of the companies I worked for. And I'm an advocate of test automation, CI/CD, continuous testing processes, and also process automation, which is not exactly test automation, but sometimes I think we can also provide some value in automating some of the processes in our company, and that eventually brings a lot of value. And this is not collaborating with me. Okay, so API testing. Let's talk a little bit about API testing. So API test, about API testing, let's first go into what is an API. So an application programming interface, that's what the acronym means, is an intermediary that allows two applications to talk to each other. And usually when we talk about API testing, we are talking about HTTP APIs, because you could, for instance, say that the methods of a class, of a code class, can be the API for that class. But usually when we talk about API testing in a context of quality assurance and testing, we talk about HTTP APIs. And usually it involves a request to a server and a response back to the client. And API testing, a short definition, is a type of software testing that exercises an API to assess whether it meets its requirements, functional and non-functional. So it can be a lot of stuff. When you're testing an API, you can be doing functional tests, performance tests, security tests, etc. And it's usually done against either internal services or public APIs. So you might have an architecture that's based on microservices, and you want to test your internal services in isolation. That gives you more flexibility in terms of tests. It's more, and you have more testability. Or you can also have a public API where you test in sort of a gray, let's call it a gray box technique, where you use the public API to interact with all the internal services. And usually what you usually see is a post to some endpoint, then a get, a put, a delete. Maybe this is like a put, like a create, update, read, and delete. This is a regular scenario for testing. So OpenAPI specifications, what are these? So first, as an introduction, the definition from the OpenAPI initiative itself. So the OpenAPI specification defines a standard programming language agnostic interface description for HTTP APIs, which allows both humans and computers to discover and understand the capabilities of a service without requiring access to source code, additional documentation, or inspection of network traffic. So this is like a big definition. Well, not that big, but in simple terms, it will look somewhat like this. So it's usually a YAML file. There's also a direct conversion to JSON, but it's usually a YAML file where you define your resources. So you have paths to your resources. So for instance, for a pet resource, and then you can have different verbs you can use. This is usually used for RESTful APIs. So you'll have a post, for instance, for in this case, it's for a pet. So it's an API that will create a pet somewhere. And you can add a summary, you can add a description for documentation purposes. You can define what responses you expect the API to return. So if it's a 201 codes for a pet added, 400 for an invalid input, and you can also define the properties that you want for your request and also for your response. And then do whatever you need with this. So there's a couple of use cases. I'm going to explain those in the next slide, I think. But basically, so this is a human readable format, yet it's also parsable by computers. So you can do a lot of stuff, automate a lot of stuff, and you can also read it yourself and understand how the API is supposed to be designed. So what can we use an OpenAPI specification for? So some common use cases, there might be more, but for development, for instance, you can use it to implement an API based on the specification. So you would use it for API design. It could be used when you are just designing your API, a new API, and you want to get everyone on the same page, so you get everyone to write what they want in an OpenAPI specification format. You can use it to implement an application against mocks based on specification. So imagine you're doing a UI and you don't have the backend ready yet. If you have the specification for the backend already, you can probably generate some stuff, some mocks, and you can then implement your UI against that specification, against those mocks, because you already know how the API is going to be developed. And you can also auto-generate API client SDKs. There's like a lot of generators online for multiple programming languages, and you can use the one that fits you better. Sometimes I use this, but I don't use everything they generate, but I might grab, for instance, maybe the client or maybe the models, because they usually generate a lot of boilerplate code that maybe you won't like, but you can also always grab something from there, or maybe just for a quick test, it might be useful. Then for documentation, you can auto-generate user-friendly documentation. There are lots of platforms nowadays that support OpenAPI specifications. Some of them are free, others are paid and give you more features naturally. But they can generate pretty documentation from your OpenAPI specification. They give you things like code snippets. They also allow you to manage changes to your API specification. So there's a lot you can do with this for documentation as well. They also generate like HTML clients, so you can, in the documentation itself, you can interact with the API in some cases. And then for testing, which is the most important for us here, so you can use the specifications as a test oracle. So when you're executing your tests, you can, whenever you have a doubt, like, oh, should this header be here, or should this body have this sort of information, you can check the OpenAPI specification, and if it was designed correctly, you should be able to get to a conclusion that, okay, no, the OpenAPI specification says that this shouldn't be here, or this field should be mandatory, things like this. And sometimes you might find bugs in the application, other times you will find bugs in the OpenAPI specification. So yeah, we are not perfect, so we might introduce some data we don't want on the OpenAPI specification as well, but when we collaborate, we have a lot of collaboration between product development and testing. That collaboration can ultimately be useful to understand this sort of discrepancies and come up with the what we think that actually should be the solution. You can also use it to generate to auto-generate test skeletons. So there are some generators that also do that. You can also auto-generate API client SDKs similarly, like as what you would do for development. But in this case to be used for testing, for automated testing mostly. And you can also do contract validation when you are doing your automated tests. So these are like very useful tests, because a lot of times what I see people do is that they are checking field by field and they're writing in their test cases, they're writing like, okay, you have to have this list of fields. If you have an OpenAPI specification, you can just say, hey, check this response or this request I'm doing against what is on the OpenAPI specification. So this would be like one line of code instead of a bunch of lines where you are making all your checks manually, and it will immediately tell you everything. So if a parameter that is required is not in your request, or if a parameter that has a couple of options and those options are and the response, for instance, doesn't have one of those options as well, there's a lot of things you can define on the OpenAPI side. So that is very useful for testing. And without further ado, let's go straight to our demo. So for the demo, I'm going to show a couple of tools. So I'm going to start with ReDoc, which is mostly used for documentation, Swagger, which you can use for documentation and also for testing. Then we'll see how we can edit and navigate OpenAPI specifications using VS Code, and then a little more hands-on testing with Postman and a Python sample project as well. So let me stop sharing this here and go straight to our demo. Okay, so I have this, not this, this. Okay. So yeah, I was saying I was going straight to ReDoc, but just showing that I have my PetStar OpenAPI YAML file here. So this is the OpenAPI spec. This one is in one file, but there are ways you can break down the spec in multiple files. So for instance, if you have a big service or a big API with multiple resources, you can divide it by resource, for instance. In this case, just for this sample, for this demo, I'm going to use this simpler sample. So first thing, let's see ReDoc. So ReDoc is a documentation generator, and you can use this if you go to this URL, redoc.ly github.io/redoc. You can immediately upload a file and see what the result would be for your OpenAPI spec. Just trying to find my spec here. Okay, and here we go. And it's this one. There was already a PetStar here, but it wasn't mine. PetStar, for anyone who doesn't know, is a very commonly used sample for this sort of things, for Swagger, for OpenAPI specs, etc. So you might be familiar with it. And if you want to quickly generate some documentation for your API and you have an OpenAPI specification, you can just upload a file here. There are CLIs that also generate this HTML you can use to generate and upload to your own servers as well. And they also have a paid version, but let's not go there. So yeah, this has things like an introduction, authentication, etc., which you can see that is defined in this info section of the OpenAPI specification. So all that is translated into this HTML, and then you have your resources. You can navigate here on the left. So for instance, for the pet resource, you have a lot of operations here. So you can start by posting a new pet and adding. So this will add a new pet to your PetStar. And you can see that it shows the authorizations you need here to execute this request, and also the object that you should be sending to this resource. And within the object, you can see things like whether they're required or not, the properties are required or not. You can see things like, okay, this needs to have less than 20 items. this must be non-empty, this one must be one of these values. So you can use this, for instance, to generate your test cases. So by looking at this, you could have a couple of test cases. So a simple success test case, a test case where you test this boundary, a test case where you test this without any value, a test case where you test sending a different status and seeing what your API behavior is. So this is very useful even for whoever is just doing their first tests in APIs using any tool to just come up with some ideas. And also the responses. So for instance, since there's a 200 response and the 400 response documented, you most likely should be doing tests to reach each of these responses. And then there's like things like samples, etc. You can explore this easily on your own. Just upload an OpenAPI spec here and see what you get. And there's also Swagger, which many of you may be familiar with. They have an online editor here. So I can, for instance, paste my OpenAPI specification here, and it will immediately generate a Swagger client here. So Swagger is both the documentation and it works as a client. So for instance, I already have here my local server, and I can, for instance, let's see an easy one, maybe this get pets by ID. You can immediately try out your request here. So I want every pet, and you see that this returns a list of pets. So this works for some basic testing. You can just start testing your API here, and for instance, it also allows you to edit this and see if you are making the wrong thing. So for instance, if I add a key here with some stuff that shouldn't be there, it will say that, okay, you have a property here that shouldn't be in your API spec. So it also helps you with things like this. So yeah, this is a good thing for you to start. But if you want to get a little more professional, let's say like that, you can also use VS Code, for instance, and use extensions. There's a very good extension I use. If you go to the extensions panel and write OpenAPI, I don't know why I have my caps lock on. Looks like I'm screaming here, and I use this one. There's quite a few you can use. I use this OpenAPI Swagger editor, and it's very cool because it gives you a lot of stuff. It gives you autocomplete, it gives you navigation, it detects errors in the spec as well, and it also enables you to display either Swagger or ReDoc as a preview. So for instance, for this one, let me open my API spec. So one thing it does is it gives you autocomplete for references. One thing OpenAPI allows you to do is to have reusable components. So for instance, if I navigate down here, you can see, for instance, this pet is a reusable component, and categories are also reusable components. And I have this category reference here. If I do Control and click, I'll go straight to the reference to category, and I can see the properties for category. An easy way to navigate with this plugin as well is with this left menu here. So it shows you everything you have in your OpenAPI spec and allows you to navigate easily, because this is a big file, like you can see. It's a simple file and yet it's big, so it has like near 500 lines. And here you can see what it has. So for instance, on general, you have the info property, the tags, you have external docs, so this is about documentation, and then you have your path. So you can see that you have endpoints for pet with ID. For instance, within pet with an ID, you have a delete and a get method. And if you click here, it will take you immediately to the delete method, for instance. So this is very easy to navigate. It also allows you to see the tags you have. Tags are used to group things. So you can see that you have quite some tags. So you can have 2 tags, and inside each tag you see the operations you have. There's also all the operations without being sorted by tags. The servers, right here, I just have my local host because that's where I'm running my pet store. And you also can see the components inside schemas. So there's a pet, there's a tag, there's an order, etc. And you can also navigate and see the properties. So yeah, this is what an OpenAPI spec looks like. This is how you can navigate it with ease. Now let's see how we can use. Actually, let me just show you the preview here. You have this preview button here, and it immediately shows a Swagger. On the settings, you can switch between ReDoc and Swagger, but even from here, you can also do what we did in the Swagger editor. So you can execute this, and you can immediately start testing your API from inside the Visual Studio. But let's go to somewhere else. Let's go to Postman, which is a tool a lot of you may be acquainted with. It's a very useful tool to start testing your APIs, to make some quick requests, and even to automate some simple tests. I wouldn't recommend using it as an automation tool, although it has some automation capabilities, but it will be cumbersome and it will be hard to actually write the tests. It's easy to create the requests, but writing the tests and having them with a flow and everything else, it may be a little trickier. But let's see how we can leverage this inside Postman and some curious things it has to offer. So we have this API section here on the left, and you can import your spec directly here. So let me come here. Okay, already on my folder. So I'm going to import my YAML file here. So it detected my API, and I'm going to import it as is. There are some settings you can change, but for this demo, this is enough. And it imported my spec, and I can see the definition here. So it shows me the endpoints it has. So there's a little navigation here as well, a different way of showing things, but in the end it's the same. And you can also see your YAML file here. You can probably make some edits to it inside Postman. But let's go to the cool part where we actually play around with the API a little bit. So let's start with the pet resource. So there's just the general pet resource and the pet using the ID in the path. And we'll start with adding a pet to the pet store. And I'm going to add a body here. There's a predefined body here, but I want to create my own pet. Let me grab it from here. And I'm going to say that I want to create a pet which name is Mr. Peanut Butter, and the status is none. So my pet is going to be created as soon as I click send here. And okay, cool. I have a new pet. Its ID is 17. It's Mr. Peanut Butter. There are no photo URLs, no tags, and the status is none. But there's a curious thing here. If you notice, there's a warning up here. So if you click the warning, you can immediately see that Postman has validated your request against the OpenAPI spec, and it tells you what is wrong here. So for instance, on the request body is the data you sent to the server. It should have the photo URLs, and the status should be equal to one of the allowed values. So if we come here, we can see on our components, let me close this one. We can see on our pet properties that, okay, here we are, pet, this is the pet, and it says that the name and the photo URLs are required. So yeah, it says that we didn't send any photo URL, and that's correct. So we messed up. That's on us. And also the status, I sent it as none, and it should be one of these. It should be available, pending, or sold. So yeah, we messed up on the request. And then on the response, it should have the property tags with at least one item, and we can see that it doesn't have any item there. And the status again should be equal to one of the allowed values, but it's not. So yeah, there are some mistakes here. So to fix these, we should probably see if the mistake is in the OpenAPI spec, if it's in the implementation of the server. So there's a couple of things you can do here. So this is just a pure request, but you can also add some tests here. And I'm going to add a quick test here, just to check a couple of things. So usually people would do tests like this. So you would say, okay, I want to check that the name and the status are returned. I want to say that an ID is returned. Maybe you want to set the ID as a global so you can use on the next request. And if we send it, we can see that, okay, we have our test results here, and the tests passed, but we can see that these tests are not covering what an OpenAPI spec validation would cover. So this may not be enough. And so let's add another request and another test. So let's do, for instance, this get pet by ID. We know that our ID is 17 by now, and we can send this request. And again, we know that we have two issues here. So again, the tags and the status. But right now we don't have any tests to prove that. So we want to add some tests. And Postman actually allows you to add some tests. Right now they don't have like a good mechanism to do this. So you have to add a tiny validator for JSON data. This allows you to validate against the JSON schema. JSON schema and the properties in the OpenAPI spec are more or less interchangeable, so you might be able to work with this. So this gives you a sample of what you can do with this sort of validation, but we are going to customize this to our needs. And let me grab this from here, from somewhere else. And yeah, this requires a small level of programming knowledge. This is JavaScript, but it's very easy to understand what's going on here. So I'm going to test that the schema is valid. I pass the schema here. This is a JSON, but the JSON is the exact translation from the YAML file. So I'm going to check that the name must be of type string and the status must be one of these. So it must be a string and it must be one of these. And I'm going to use the tiny validator to validate this. So if I send this request, now we have our tests here and we know that this is failing because there was an error. Unfortunately, Postman doesn't offer a good way to see the errors, but if we open the console, I had a warning there, an error log there, and we can see the error here. So it says no enum match for none. So we understand that, okay, this is the error. The error is that it's not matching what we expect for that. And if you want to actually use Postman for automation, you can then do things like, for instance, if you come to the pet endpoint here, you can use the runner, and you can do, for instance, the add pet, add new pet, and then the find pet by ID. And let's take this away. And you can just run this, and you have sort of a suit here. So you see that, okay, you have your error here. So this first test passed and this one failed. And then they also offer some things for you to automate a run, like scheduling a run, using a CLI or integrating with a CI/CD tool. But these are more advanced stuff we are not going to cover here today. But this is one way you can start with OpenAPI specs using Postman. It's sort of intuitive, and you can do some stuff here, even if it's just to try it out and see the results. Then, if you want to actually get proficient in have a full-blown coding automation project, you can use any language you want. Here, I'm going to demonstrate a couple of Python things. So let me grab my project here. So, okay, I want to show a couple of things here. It's not going to take long, but I want to we also talked about generating clients. So one of the things that Swagger allows you to do is to generate a client. So I have my OpenAPI spec here, and I can easily come here and generate a client, for instance, for Python. So this is what I would want. Someone doing stuff in JavaScript would use the JavaScript one. So I can just click here and it will generate a client, and I can download the client here. I already have the client on this over here. So these are the files it created. So it created a client. There's also some docs. So for instance, let's see what there is for pet. So on the docs, you can see that you can see the properties for a pet, for instance, among some other stuff for some other things as well. It has a README with the documentation on how to use this SDK client, and it also generates a couple of tests. So it also generates your test skeleton. Let's call it like this. It's a very minimal one. So it has, for instance, for the pet API, tests for add pet, delete pet, etc. But you would want to expand on this. This is a good thing to start, but you want to expand. So, for instance, a first level would be add pet with valid data and invalid data. So to exercise the status code 200 and 400 like we saw before. And then within the 400, you can try to use the boundaries, like that excessive amount of items, sending things that values that are not expected, etc. But this is a good place to start. And they also, like I was saying, in the README, they also provide some code snippets. And for instance, if I use, let's try using this one. I can very quickly have a test here. So this is for pets. So, okay, I'm going to say I want the pets in status available, and I can quickly run this test. And yeah, it ran. You have a quick test here. There are no validations here. You need to add validations, but you can, just like this, you have a test in Python written, and you almost didn't write any code. But again, like I mentioned, there is like a lot of boilerplate code behind this. So there are like a lot of files you might want to clean up. You may not like the way the client is modeled. So you may not use everything, but I'm just giving you some options here. And myself, I like to create my clients. Sometimes I use the models, and I'm also creating my project with some cool validations using OpenAPI specifications, and this would be my project. So I have a very simple client here. I created myself, so it uses the requests library, and it does things like post pet. It has the endpoints for post pet, get pet, put pet, delete pet, etc. These are it's like not a lot of code. It's easy to implement, and I also implemented an OpenAPI validator. On the other project, there was no validation. It was just auto-generated code, but nothing was being validated against the OpenAPI unless you use the models. If you use the models, then a lot of things will be validated, but not everything. So I have created this project. I'm thinking of maybe making it open source. Some of the libs I created here. But basically, what I'm able to do with this is create some tests. And in these tests, like I mentioned, using the OpenAPI spec, I just send in one line of code to validate, and it will validate all the properties in my responses. So for instance, here, I'm sending this request body. So I'm just doing a post pet with this data. I'm asserting the status code myself. And then I'm saying, okay, so this response JSON, I want to validate it against the resource pet, the path pet, the verb post, and whatever should be in the 200 response. And then I have a couple of things like these are some extensions I did, so it can ignore some nulls, some extra properties I may not want to validate. And if I run this test, I'll see that, okay, I have an error here, so the error is the same we've been exploring, and I can see it here, so validation error, none is not one of available, pending, and sold. So yeah, I shouldn't be using this here. So let's try changing this to available, for instance. And if I run my test again, it will pass. It is validated against the OpenAPI spec. So this is a very easy way to validate all your properties. Of course, you'll have to do some more tests, some functional tests, business tests, etc. But like I've been showcasing right now, OpenAPI specs are a great way to understand how your API should be designed, how it should respond to your requests, how you should even make your requests, and you can auto-generate a lot of stuff, even like boilerplate code, test case skeleton, etc. And yeah, this is what I had to show you today. I hope this was useful for you. Sorry, I overstepped a little bit on the time, but I hope you all enjoyed.
Yeah, great, Diogo.
Thank you, Diogo. Now it is the perfect timing for questions. Do you have any questions about what we talked about? I saw that Sergio said that Tiny Validator was a cool feature because he wasn't aware of it when he showed the Swagger.
Oh yeah, yes, tiny validator. Yeah, they actually have. I've seen their issue tracker on GitHub, and they're planning. There are a lot of people pushing so that you can validate like straight from the spec, because you have the spec available. You shouldn't have to actually come here and add the schema, because the schema is available in Postman already, and they're thinking of implementing that, which in my opinion would be awesome. But yeah, there is this tiny validator, and you can use it to do some quick validations using this JSON schema.
Okay, anyone? Questions? Do you like to share some comments?
Yeah, any experiences using OpenAPI specs, stuff I don't know about and is cool and I should be also using? Be great as well.
Yeah.
Well, in my experience, it changed a lot, yes, both development and testing experience, because you show a lot of improvement on the testing experience to remove all the, I would say, less interesting part of testing API, to explicit a lot of fields that then break and all that type of stuff. And in fact, I think it creates that type of abstraction and collaboration layers. So between components at the technical layers, if it's done well, between the business and functional layers, and then also between the teams. And in fact, for me, it was very efficient ways to improve API testing, because you can have, I think, a much better also clarity on the API, what it's supposed to do, the object modelization, etc. So for tester, it's more, for me, user-friendly or easier to understand. You are less going into detail of the technical fields, etc., trying to understand what it is. And for developers also, they can more focus on doing a proper API rather than trying to explain a strange behavior, etc. So yeah, for me, I think it's anyone, in fact, building API, I think should really, true API, not a CRUD API I was talking at the beginning. I think they should really invest in the OpenAPI contract. And as you said, it's open source, it's a market standard, so I think it's very good, and it does not break, I think, the initial promise also of REST to remain the lightweight and relatively simple to use. Because for the ones that have worked and tried to test SOAP and other type of protocols, it can be quite a nightmare only to do like a status API call, etc. So
yeah. One of the things you said, it's the communication layer. I think that is very important. And that really helped in some of my previous jobs, because I've seen people design APIs with the most weird design patterns and using like weird diagrams and stuff like that. So this is a standard. This is something that, it requires you to have some knowledge about how to read it, etc. But I think it's quite intuitive after a while. And it allows everyone to communicate and to find gaps. So product owner, a technical product owner, let's say, can find problems in the spec, a tester can find problems in the spec, a developer can find problems, they can all collaborate. You can use merge requests, for instance, to track changes to the spec, etc. So there really are some cool usages for these OpenAPI specs, and I've used it in the past. It was very useful, and that's why I thought I would share some of the stuff I've done with it.
Yeah, nice showing.
Would you like to make any comments? Do you have any questions?
So Diogo, so you have one question here. Do you see this more like something more tailored for developers, testers, or both?
No, I think both. Of course, I mean, even a tester who is not very technical can get this structure into his knowledge and make use of it. Even if it's just doing manual testing, just like grabbing Postman like I did, it would help a tester that is not very technical, because Postman, for instance, here immediately raises two issues here, and he just needs to read it. And even if he needs to go back to the developer and ask for help, it's definitely useful. So yeah, I would say it fits everywhere. It fits for development, like I said, and I showed on the slides, for developers, for testers and also for people like technical writers. Technical writers can also make use of this. So this is my opinion on the matter. I really like OpenAPI specs, so I might be suspicious here, but but I've seen it work, so that's why I like it.
Okay, no, but great. So thanks a lot for the sharing. If you have any not ideas, it's also part of our work to find ideas, but if you have themes that you would like to be covered in next event, feel free to join. And I can also recommend, if you don't know, Sergio is animating with Cristiano Cunha a podcast on QA therapy. So I can recommend you to also listen to that podcast if you are normally you like QA and testing from the audience. So can only recommend. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
We also have, regarding APIs at Test Automation Camp, we also have some courses focused on APIs. So if you want to check it out, we also have an 81% discount. I will leave it here on the chat. So feel free to take a look at it.
Okay, thanks. See you next time. So.
Thank you.
And thanks for the link, Sergio. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.